Now, for those as you're coming in and getting settled, we are starting on time, and I'm starting us, though, with a conversational starter. So then that way we can all kind of get settled, and it also gets us all flowing in the same direction. And so what I would love for you to do is turn to either a neighbor right next to you, or if you want to talk at a table, or if you're with us online, you can percolate either amongst yourself in the chat or with anyone that you're gathered with. And I want you to just share, coming into this space today, how would you define Christian nationalism? What do you think Christian nationalism is? It's getting bantered around a lot now. But it's one of those things that it's kind of like, you know, we all talk about the kingdom of God, and everyone's like, I believe in the kingdom of God. And you're like, so what is the kingdom of God? And everyone's like, I believe in the kingdom of God, right? So I invite you then to just turn to a neighbor or chat or whatever you want to do. How would you define in this moment, what is Christian nationalism? What do you, and or why are you here, if that's too much? So we'll start there, start some conversation. We'll do that for a few minutes, and then I'll invite us back together. If you're just joining us, the invitation was to turn to a neighbor and share, coming into today, how might you define Christian nationalism, and or what brought you here today, and or you can just say pass. We'll take a couple more minutes, and then we'll come back together. So take a couple more minutes. Okay, I'll invite whoever is sharing to wrap up, and we'll come back together in about 30 seconds. Welcome, welcome. There's some chairs over in the corner here. Well, I, first of all, just want to say thank you so much for coming out. Like this, really grateful to be here with you, whether you're online or here in person. And I think most of you know I'm Sara, but hello, I'm Sara. I'm very glad to be with you. And this is a two-part series that we're doing together. Today, I'm going to spend most of the session broadly outlining, in general, what are we talking about when we're talking and speaking and when you're reading things about Christian nationalism. And then I'm going to begin to make some connections, more particularly for us as, I would say broadly, most of us identify as Christian, to theologically problematize Christian nationalism. And I'm going to make some connections between Christian nationalism and a school of thought known as political theology, which I think can help us to begin to understand some of what is at stake. And that's what we'll be doing today. So it's more setting it up, framework. Next time, I'm going to delve into some of what I did in my dissertation related to conceptions of God and understanding of Christian spiritual formation that I believe can help us both within ourselves to do the work, I think, of really following the way of Jesus, the way of the cross, which I'll speak more about, and also hopefully in conversation with others, to be able to name and discern amongst, you would say discern the spirits, discern with love, but with thoughtfulness, how to articulate and converse with others about what does it mean for us to follow Jesus in our time. So that will be the second set, okay? I'm going to do something that's a little different for me, which is I'm going to spend some time reading from some manuscript. In this space, though, what I would say is I'm going to pause at different points and ask if there are any hey, could we speak about this thing you just named? Or, so if you're noticing a question, try to hold it in yourself for a minute. I'll pause, and then we'll see what surfaces, and we'll go from there. Any questions, though, before we really get started? Okay, great. Well, I'm going to say a prayer then as we begin. God of Jacob and Sarah, of Rahab, of Hagar, and God of all of us. Discerning what it means to follow you and to do so in this time and in these skins. God, it's a lifelong journey. So we pray that your Spirit will continue to work within us, to soften us more deeply, to be held within your love. So that any of the things that we reach for that we think will keep us safe or give us meaning or power or security or safety, God, that you might, with loving kindness, help us to release those things and to more deeply discover the way of life through Jesus. Amen. So, Christian nationalism. It's more recently, in the last couple years, become a term that has been bandied about, been discussed, has gotten to the point where it's actually commonplace in our popular culture, in the news, etc. So we each probably have some level of sense of Christian nationalism. There's something we're talking about. I want to start off by giving some more of a sense of some of the elements at play when I think we are naming something as Christian nationalism. Fundamentally, in the folks who have been writing on Christian nationalism, they name that this is an ideological belief. And particularly here, I'm going to focus on American Christian nationalism. It's a belief held by many about America's Christian heritage, calling, and destiny. Since the founding of America by European settlers, Our colonial history has essentially been one that has wedded being Christian with being an American. And sometimes those get conflated in really interesting ways. As a good Minnesotan, I say that word. You can find out later what I mean by that word, right? Bless my heart, yeah. There have been tensions between this Christian nationalist stream that we see going back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And if you would like, I can recommend to you Christian's class on congregationalism, in which he in part details the divergent threads that we see even in the origins of congregationalism in the United States. And one of the threads has been that which has been much more theocratic, wanting to have everyone be legislated according to a particular understanding of Christianity, and one that has been much more critical and concerned about overly wedding state and church. So there have been these tensions throughout the history of our country since it's been settled and colonized between this stream, this Christian nationalist stream, and more prophetic streams of Christianity. And this conflict, I would argue, and I'm not alone in this, has been re-exposed in profound ways in reaction to the presidency of Barack Obama and the rise in resurgent white supremacy in US politics that led to the election of Donald Trump and the political warring that we see up until today. As Andrew Whitehead and Samuel L. Perry note in their 2020 book, Taking Back America for God, I will commend this book to you, and also Whitehead and Perry are two of the kind of groundwork writers in the area of Christian nationalism, also very accessible to read. So I would highly recommend their work. So they know that Christian nationalism is more than the role that Christian ideals or symbols have played in public life in the United States. So this is the core of what they're saying. Christian nationalism is about preserving, forming, and preserving a kind of social order, okay? This isn't about Jesus. It's about a kind of social order based off of hierarchies of race, religion, gender, and other social demarcations of identity. Okay, so Christian nationalism is actually about the employing of Christian symbols, Christian language, Christian doctrine in order to support hierarchies of identities and who is in power. We are talking about power. And I will be very clear that from the outset, I believe that the way of Jesus is the way of the cross. Lutheran theologians, including Dietrich Bonhoeffer, have long written about that all of us have human inklings towards theologies of glory, theologies that keep us preserved in our egos and our identities, and that the way of Jesus is always the way of the cross, right? It's not by power nor by might, but it's by spirit. That's not all here. That's me just riffing a little bit. Yeah, thanks, So, got my Baptist on now. I was raised Baptist, in case you didn't know that. But I think that's really important. This is really fundamentally about forming and preserving a kind of social order. I will just also note the work of Philip Groski in his American Covenant, A History of Civil Religion from Puritans to the Present. You can always tell when an academic's written a book. He writes that Christian nationalism more explicitly seeks to align America's national identity, iconography, and policies with a white evangelical Christian God, seeking fusion between national and Christian identities, which he sees as a problem. So research around Christian nationalism notes that Christian nationalists tend to draw rigid boundaries around ethnic and cultural group membership, justifying harsher penalties, biases, and/or excessive use of force against racial minorities. For instance, Perry et al. Have a study, God's Country in Black and Blue, How Christian Nationalism Shapes America's Views About America's Mistreatment of Blacks and Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, which, by the way, this is very weird for me to be talking to you like this. I'll just say that because I don't usually quote Sociology of Race and Ethnicity in sermons. So, in the article, this article I just named, what they note is that those who identify with Christian nationalism, so there's surveys and ways that they've been codifying and categorizing if someone who identifies as Christian is embodying more of a faith that's more Christian nationalist or not. Okay. One of the things that they note is that those who identify with Christian nationalism are actually less religious, and this is measured by self-reporting. Okay, so it's any of us saying, do you attend worship? Do you pray? And do you read the Bible? Anyone who statistically, anyone who self-reports that they go to church regularly, they read their Bible, and they pray a lot, tend to have lower categorization of Christian nationalism. So that was my plug for going to church. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a little suspicious of that, by the way, I'll just say, because I've gone to church my whole life, and sometimes it helps me follow Jesus really well. So as they note, that those who identify with Christian nationalism are actually less religious, meaning they are more shaped by the mythology of American Christian nationalism than they are by Christian faith. Okay, so the idea of what it means to be white American Christian versus sell all you have and give it to the poor, aka Jesus, right? That those things, often it's actually the idea of what it means that we're so wrapped up in and may not even be able to identify it. As they write, even more significantly, Americans who are more religious we're actually less likely to affirm our race and policing measures once we controlled for Christian nationalism. Okay, so again, the more folks go to church, have a private Christian spirituality, the less likely they are to respond to things in ways that will get coded as racist. Those who identify as white evangelicals remain Trump's biggest supporters and continually show up as being those least inclined to believe systemic injustices exist. For instance, using data collected just after the Baltimore riots in April 2015, Robert Jones of Public Religion and Research Institute, we read his book here, The End of White Christian in America. Highly recommend the book. It is one of my favorite books in a not warm and fuzzy sort of way. He notes in his book that although 74% of Black Americans believed that recent police killings of Black men were part of a larger trend, so 74%, 75, three-fourths, only 29% of white evangelicals agreed. And instead, 57% of white evangelicals felt that the killings were isolated events. Jones concludes in his book that white evangelicals' unwillingness to acknowledge discrimination may stem from concerns about white Christians' waning cultural and political influence in the United States, leading to a loss of empathy, increasing conflict between them and people of color. Okay, so basically what he's saying is an acknowledging is when as a people, if you feel like your identity is under threat or has been in a particular position of power, you actually retrench and tend to power up even more, right? So you'll see this anytime throughout history, if there was a movement of increasing women's rights, there would be a group who'd always come and try to attack that because it's disrupting a sense of identity and power that they had. So he names that. So fundamentally, and then I'm going to pause in a second. In naming Christian nationalism, this isn't to say that you cannot be a Christian and love being an American, okay? I am a Christian. I profess that anyway. I'm working on it. I follow Jesus. And I'm also a U.S. citizen. And I'm actually like profoundly patriotic. Like, I'm also like critically reflective about history and all those sorts of things, but I think that's part of being a part of anything for me, right? So to say someone is an American Christian nationalist doesn't mean you hate America, doesn't ask you to hate America, but it's naming the ways in which Christianity really gets co-opted and becomes part of a mythological, symbolic power structure, right? It's about power and identities and employs Christian language and imagery. And that is what, when people are talking about Christian nationalism, like my issue is not with Republicans, my issue is not with Trump. But when we're naming stuff about Christian nationalism, it's about being reflective as people who follow Jesus, right? Am I getting caught up in having my faith being employed or weaponized to preserve power of my own identity? And am I able to be reflective about that and let my faith disrupt that or not? So Christian nationalism, again, really is about this mythology, the symbols, and about how power and identity functions. I'm going to pause there. Any significant questions that you want to vocalize at this moment? And I'm going to keep coming. We're not done, but I just want to pause if there's. Okay. Yeah. Ooh. I see that hand over there. I am getting my Baptist on. I'm going to come and have you do a testimony up front here. Yes, Jim.
I was just wondering if the rise of the NONEs has what effect that might have.
Oh, that's a great. Okay, so the NONEs are the in the Pew the religious surveys of the surveys of religious affiliation. We have seen a significant rise in the last number of years in folks who do not identify with any particular religion, or they may have been raised, in particular, dominantly the United States, since it was colonized and settled, has been Christian. Most people's, and they weren't doing Pew Research studies back in the 19th century. But so one of the things actually. As the Pew is looking at their research, one of the reasons actually is because of the ways in which the church has been seen as participating in perpetuating harm against racial and other minorities. And so a lot of folks, like I've said to you before, none of my friends who I grew up going to church with, none of them go to church. And the reason for almost to a person, is because, and I grew up very conservative, evangelical, is because they were like, I'm taking the Bible seriously. I'm trying to love the poor and care for my neighbor, etc. And they felt like there wasn't space for them in church. Okay. So I think that's one of the reasons why from my seat, even doing the dissertation the way that I did, I just got emotional. Because this is my faith. And I do love Jesus. And I'm not willing to cede it, right? And so part of this is actually me working out my own salvation, and being like, what does it mean to follow Jesus? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for us? Where have I gotten it wrong? Where might have invitations to keep growing? Where might we as a church? What does it mean for me to follow Jesus as a white woman? What does that mean in our time? Those sorts of questions. So because I'm actually probably, I'm basically a nun who happens to be a pastor and still loves, loves Jesus, right? Probably surprising no one. Yeah, Elgin.
I don't know if this is fair or not, but in the spirit of wrestling, how would a Christian nationalist defend themselves?
So the question, I think some of you know that, you know how it talks about how Paul's I was a Benjamite of Benjamites and those sorts of things? Anybody? That's like in the Bible, right? You know when Paul's like, I got street cred? He's naming all this stuff. Okay, so I do have street cred. The only problem with me is I'm a female. I don't actually think being a female is a problem. But in the world I was raised in, right? Like I spent a semester at school at Focus on the Family Leadership Institute, which was for training the next generation of the moral majority. And so I think, and so I'm going to give I think there are various reasons, just like all of us are individuals and have our own various reasons for how we inhabit our faith. But I'm going to name maybe a couple of strands or threads. I think one of it is we're all formed in particular ways and understandings. And so, for instance, if you've been raised in a context in which you're told, if you follow Jesus and you take seriously the Bible, then you need to believe that women need to stay home and be submissive. Okay, that was how I was raised. I spent the decades of my life praying that God would help me to become the right kind of Christian. Because I believed in Jesus and I wanted to follow Jesus, and I was told that the way to follow Jesus looked like this. So I think for a certain swath of folks, we've been tutored in a belief that here's what it means to be an American. Here's what it means to be a Christian. Less overtly, here's what it means to be white. Because people don't usually walk around being like, so to be properly white, here's what you need to do. You're just raised in the water, right? And so I think for a lot of folks with really good hearts and good people are just like living out faith as all their pastors and everyone have told them to. And we're just trying to be Christian, right? Then I do think that there are some people who are much more nefarious, and they know what they're doing. And this is what concerns me personally as a Christian, is the ways in which you see people, and I would argue, you can disagree with me, I would argue Donald Trump has done this phenomenally, is you take, and you see this in preachers, like I know how I could do this. If I wanted to become a rich preacher, I know what I would need to do in order to manipulate people, right? I'd actively try to not do that. So if you ever feel like I'm doing that, please call me out on it. I'll totally take it. But the ways in which you see media conglomerates, like who do you think is interested in us all believing that there's no such thing as truth anymore? Right? Who do you think is benefiting financially from what's happening in our country? Like, what's at stake? What's at play here? And so, like, well, we'll just talk about Jesus and then everyone will follow us. I'll just sell you all a Bible and everything will be great. Like, so there's some people who know what they're doing. And that's part of where I'm going to go next in my dissertation, or not I'd go there in my dissertation. Where I'm going next with you all is I'm going to make a connection between political theology and why I went there in my dissertation and how I think it can be helpful for us today to understand some of the theoretical work that was at play in the Weimar Republic, in National Socialism, in employing Christian nationalism for profoundly harmful ends. I am not saying we are Nazi Germany, okay? I'm just saying that there are theoretical threads. So I think part of the work then is to continue to be reflective and open ourselves to how is the Spirit inviting us to learn and unlearn ways of being that all of us have learned. Like, right? Like that is an ongoing, that's part of why I read books from people of totally different perspectives. Because I'm not a black person in America, right? I remember the first time I heard someone say, and excuse me, and I don't believe this, but cops are pigs. And I was like, oh my gosh, like what is wrong with you? Like you're terrible, you're an awful, like how could you? Because I grew up believing police were my friends. Like they were for me. It was really positive, you know? And so then I started getting curious and I was like, so either they're just all terrible people who hate cops or there might be something else going on, right? So ourselves having a posture of humility to how God is at work. And then I think being able to have language to be able to say, hey, I understand why it feels really great to wed your Christianity with being an American. But actually, when we call Jesus Lord, the reason behind that is because Caesar isn't. And that's actually a central Christian doctrine. So you can love being an American, but just remember who's the Lord. And don't lose sight of that, right? These sorts of things. So that way we can hopefully encourage and challenge each other in love too. I'm going to keep going, and then we'll come back if there's other. Okay, basically Christian nationalism. I didn't do that in like 30 seconds, did I? Sorry. This is why I didn't make a PowerPoint today. Okay. Okay, so here's the deal. As a side note, one of my favorite things in my dissertation is that it includes pop music and poetry. So I started off this chapter with a song we have sung at least once, if not twice, in the alternative service, which is "Tell Me Where Did Jesus Go?" The Browns man walking the road to Jericho. Tell me where did Jesus go? Right. So I'm going to turn to talking about political theology and Christian nationalism. And the reason I want to do this is because if Christian nationalism fundamentally is about essentially co-opting Christian symbols and story and language to enshrine particular power relationships, political theology helps us to understand this in a historic perspective. Okay, here we go. All right, so broadly, political theology. So if you hear someone be like, I do political theology and ethics, you may be like, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm going to help you to understand what I'm saying when I say that. So fundamentally, political theology can be understood as a political theory, a doctrine, or political position for which the self-understanding of the political theologian, divine revelation, I'm going to say what this actually means, is the supreme authority and ultimate ground. So basically, political theology historically can have kind of two major threads. The one is the way in which, as a person who identifies as Christian, how does your understanding of your faith impact how you understand political relationships and our political lives, right? We live in political lives where there are laws and there's bodies of justice, and like we live in that world. How does my faith intersect with that, impact how I engage, etc.? That's broadly kind of the work of political theology. Another way of understanding political theology is the ways in which these ideas come to influence how we think about the way we organize our political systems, okay? So even you think about like historic China, because why not? Where the emperor was also the divine, right? They're not alone in that. So the ways in which those systems, even where they're not overtly like the sovereign leader, they're employing categories from theology to help us to understand, they're using them in our political relationships. So you see this today, even there's this weird amalgam that I still find so strange, where the king currently of Britain, right, of Great Britain, is also the head of the church, right? And it's a sense of God, the divine sovereign, the sovereign here on earth. That's actually political theology. It's the way in which a concept about God impacts how we organize our political relationships. Does that make sense? Right? Sure. Sure. Yeah, that's fair. Okay. Okay. So here's my professor Hilla Hawker, who I think is great. So I quote her. Good job, Sarah. Notes this: the term political theology, it stands for the struggle for legitimization of power. How is power legitimized? And at the same time, so how power is legitimized and how normative moral claims can be made. The discourse on political theology can be regarded as self-reflection of the modern political or moral theory and its normative sources as a way of understanding and interpreting the current global order. So it's all this stuff about political theology, and is really how do we understand power? What are our norms that we can have in a postmodern society? And wrestling with and seeking to understand that. So in many ways, we go back to Stoic philosophy, which I won't do because I don't want anyone to throw things at me. Political theology, and in the writing going back then, was distinguished in, even at that time, that there were three powers. There was those of religion, of nature, and of myth. And so we see the way that this is like this wrestling with how does the divine and our political arrangements is something philosophically we've been wrestling with as humans for a long time. We see inside of Christianity that after Jesus, Christianity at that time is actually a minority religion, right? And it's actually, right, they're being persecuted. They're seen as a threat to the empire because if Caesar isn't Lord and Jesus is, turns out they didn't like that so much, right? Well, then, of course, Christianity becomes the religion of the state in the West and gets connected to empire. So you see this wrestling throughout the city of God, Luther's articulation of the two kingdoms. This is something we've been wrestling with as people and as the church. When we get to the Enlightenment, and its rendering of medieval metaphysical justifications for the divine are no longer seen as valid, religion becomes privatized. Okay, so as people start becoming like, they're reading more, they're encountering more, the way that religion just functioned in society where people couldn't read, etc., it didn't work the same way. And so at that point, and others have written on this, religion becomes privatized. And in response to this, there's a counter-revolutionary period where political theology functions as a critique of the Enlightenment. So like we need to get back to what it means to be under God, sort of thing. Okay, so basically what happens, I'm going to jump forward now into post-Weimar German Republic and what happens. Okay. So center to political theology again are these questions of authority, revelation, and obedience. What happens in this time in Germany is that a legal philosopher, okay, so not a pastor, not a Christian theologian, a legal philosopher known as Carl Schmitt, what he basically does is he takes the categories of Christian theology and translates them towards political ends, and does so knowingly, okay? He's doing so knowingly. In his book, Political Theology, 4 chapters on the concept of sovereignty, he argues for a political theology which is really about law, and employs, so it takes the force and the metaphors of Christianity and Christian theology and says all significant concepts of modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. So he knowingly takes basically, for instance, the Christian idea that God is sovereign, and he translates it to say what we need to do is to play on that to get people to understand the leader of the country as the sovereign. Okay. And that the more that the sovereign just does whatever they want and lives in a state of exception and doesn't follow any of the normative moral codes or rules or ways of being amongst each other, you've never encountered anyone who does anything like that, the more power they get. For just as God is not bound by human law, neither is the sovereign. And so Schmitt connects the political sovereign with the theological sovereign and refashions the political leader as God on earth. And as such, in his work, he lays the philosophical justifications for the emergence and operation of the Führer inside of National Socialism. The German leader, Vincent Lloyd, writes this, that the German leader should be reimagined in the image of God, and this is what the National Socialists promise to do. So imagine you're in a world where the normative ways of being, ways of being in relationship, political relationships, everything is getting upset and turned over, which we've had none of these sorts of things in our country or in our world, ever in anyone's lifetime who's here. That's scary. It's really, really hard for people, right? And so he is philosophically basically being like, okay, how can we consolidate power and make sure to get more of it? And so he turns to Christian concepts that become part of the philosophical underpinning that were already present. It's not like he made up Christian nationalism, okay? But he's like philosophically detailing what can happen and how to also take advantage of people. And he notes in his work, so you have the sovereign, but then part of how they have and maintain power is through the politics of exclusion. There is us, who are the people closest to God, and there is them who are not deserving of the same rights or obligations as us. So this is an identity politics of violent exclusion. The distinction between friend and enemy guarantees that the sphere of the political is ultimately determined by the real possibility of an enemy. And again, I think you see people who are brilliant, nefarious actors who are at work trying to make us, like for me even, I'll say during COVID, in the earliest days, as a person who, again, very much loves being an American, I'm like, okay, this is gonna be great for us as a country. And my backgrounds in communication and group communication dynamics have shown over and over again that if you have a group of people who have an outside enemy, they bond together and there's cohesion. And I'm like, we're gonna be Americans in the best way. I just know it, right? Because COVID is bad. And then I was like, what is happening? This isn't working the way they talked about in my group communication class, Theory 101, because I think that we're each other's enemies, right? So who benefits from that? But that's part of the operation is there is a sovereign, you identify who is the other, and then you can act against them. And so here, under this political regime where the sovereign acts beyond the rule of law, defining who is friend and enemy. And this becomes no more clear than Nazi Germany ends up becoming such a place you can point to and say, oh, that was bad, real bad, right? Like it shouldn't have happened that way. But what happens in the wake of this horror is that Christian theologians, some, let's just be clear, this was actually a minority, reapproached Christianity to say, what does it mean to dare speak the name of God in the view of the Shoah, the Holocaust, and the ways in which Christian theology got employed and weaponized by the state to harm. So there was a group of theologians who both anticipated this and then overtly named themselves as doing the work of new political theology. In this, it's both an acknowledgement that all theology was done now after Auschwitz, and it also distinguished itself over against political theology that employed Christianity in such a way as it made possible Hitler's rise to power. And so now, at the heart of their work, basically, is they're saying instead of Christianity becoming this mythology that we employ to maintain power relationships and identities, right? The role of the cross and Christian faith is that we are to be a people who are shaped by that cross. That we interrogate the relationship between the church and the state, and we're critically reflective anytime we move too much toward the state to enshrine our rights, right? I'll say this as a case in point, okay? When I was at Focus on the Family Leadership Institute, it was at the moment when there was a huge movement to get anti-LGBTQ marriage stuff into all the state constitutions, okay? At the time, theologically, and how I had been raised, I believed that God's best wasn't for persons to be gay. However, I argued as an American who is also a Christian that I thought that that was profoundly wrongheaded on a lot of levels. The one is that because as a Christian who understood something about the founding of our country and the reason like even the Congregationalists came, which was because of state-led persecution, that freedom of religion was a core value that needed to be protected, including people who did not share mine, right? And also, as a Christian, I believe that my call was to love my neighbor as myself. And so anytime I'm using the state to harm my neighbors, when they're telling me I'm harming them, I probably should listen to that. So inside of New Political Theology, it's this belief of we have to get really humble and really serious about critiquing any time as Christians we're using the state too much to make sure we stay safe or feel safe, okay? And so the church then is called to live in a critical relationship with the state, standing up for the rights of everyone, and wrestling with the reality of suffering in the world and in our political relationships. So the role then of the church, for instance, would be if Matthew Shepard is beaten and killed, the church shows up to make sure no other kid ever faces that again, right? I'm translating their work forward. So that is one of their central tenets, to demand that theology must find a language to speak in light of the horrors, and a language found only in view of critique and in solidarity with what they name as the crucified of our time. So where in the world are people experiencing harm or being crucified? There is the work of the church. That is where Jesus is calling us. And the memory of the cross demands that we do so. Okay. I think I'm going to pause there for a second. So that's broad political theology kind of thoughts. Okay, I see a finger raised over here.
Maybe I missed something. So
Yeah,
if it's the work of the church
yeah,
to stand up for the persecuted, Christian nationalism doesn't believe that.
yeah. Yep, correct.
Okay.
Right.
So it's weaponizing your faith or Christianity to harm other people, to prioritize people, to create this hierarchy.
And I would say that it's not, I think for some people, it's actively like, I want to harm people. I think most folks don't think that, but I think it's a way, and then language, just to go back to it, it's about forming and preserving a kind of social order based off of hierarchies of race, religion, gender. So I think it's anytime though, when you think of Christian nationalism, it's where there's this mythological concept that weds state and Christianity, and in a way that ends up resulting in it's really about the preservation of power and utilizing the state to make for my group to remain in power.
Do you feel like hate groups, like true hate groups, people that don't hide behind Christianity or any other thing, they're just out there? I had an experience yesterday driving down the road, and it was really upsetting, but do you think that they are co-opting Christian nationalism to pile on to minorities and other people, and that Christian nationalism is one thing, but then there's actual like hate groups that are piling on because it's like it's a vehicle for them to do the harm that they want to do to other people.
Yeah. So I'll just tell me if I'm hearing you well or not here. I think what I'm hearing, and part of what you're naming or asking is like, I don't want to create a new sort of us-them categorization, right? And like the reality that they're like, from the second I wake up, I am actually participating in oppression of people throughout the world. That's the order of human life. right? Like, that is true. Like, how goods are sourced, how things happen. I may not consciously be doing that, but I still am. And fundamentally, as Christians, we affirm that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Okay, I'm not God. That's fundamental. And yet, we can also name that there are gradations of harm in which I can actively participate, and there are variations and gradations of that. Like, right? Like, I can harm and inadvertently, I can harm through just not knowing. I can harm through being in a normative space, right? And just not understanding a different perspective. And I can harm through active abuse, desire to actively erase people, like, and that these things aren't all the same. I don't know if that's part of like what you're saying is acknowledging that there are differences. Like, to say someone is a Christian nationalist, I do not think is to say, oh, they are actively in a hate group and, you know, are just hateful, terrible people. I think to Elgin's earlier question, we all are formed in particular ways and norms, even if it's something as silly as our family, we always wash the dishes. You know, our family, we leave them in the sink. And then you realize, oh, I could do this differently on a more fundamental level. There are ways we have been formed. And I think part of the life of faith in Christian discipleship is a call to continual reformation by the Spirit. And when we realize that there are ways that how we have been formed are harming ourselves and or other people, I think following the way of Jesus challenges us to change, right? Did you come here and then over here? Sarah, are you, did I turn it on? Oh, sorry, I turned it off.
Are you saying that being a Christian is the same as being a fervent follower of Jesus?
Okay, so I will say a few things. One is that I'm not God. And so I don't, God will figure all that stuff out about who's following God or not. Just fundamentally, I just want to be clear about that. So anyone's salvation is not my determination for them or myself. But I think there's something very important that your question is naming, which is like, we live in a Christian nation. We can attest to being Christians, but I think fundamentally the life of faith is about following the way of Jesus, okay? And about seeking to. We're being on the journey, sort of thing. And so I do think that that matters, because if you just say, oh, I'm Christian in the same way I'm an American, well, then it's just an identity category, which has meaning, right? Like, I'm white, I'm Christian, I'm from Minnesota, I'm from the US, right? These are all identity categories that do tell you things about me. But there's something different about an identity category versus an intentional pathway of formation that I am walking. And I think that's fundamentally the call of Christians and of following Jesus, and this is where the way of the cross that I believe in is that, like, the following of Jesus asks our life. It asks us to keep following in the way. And I do think it's a way that's the journey of the cross, which is a way that says, hey, sweetie, all of the things, remember the scripture talks about the flesh versus the spirit. The stuff that you've been tutored in that has given you meaning and identity, right? Where Galatians talks about there's no longer Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. It's not because the identity categories went away. It's because the power politics and relationships of those identities and the ways that we think they give us power or keep us safe or make us less than, that none of that is true. Because the truth is all, Christ is all and is in all. And so, like, that's the kind of stuff when you're naming that. And I think that I've heard you name that a lot about what does it mean for us to follow the way of Jesus. And so I do think that matters, and that's what I like. If I could say anything to, like, my siblings I went to focus with, who are locked in on some of this stuff, I'd be like, I mean, there's a lot I'd want to wonder about and ask, but I just would want to be like, what do we need to lay down? Like, Because there's a sense of where we're turning to the state and to politics to power up. And God doesn't ask that. Like, that's not salvation. What's happening? There's so many things I want to ask about, but yeah. Let me come over here, DJ.
My comment is pretty simple. You talk about getting up in the morning and you're hurting someone. I would equate that to creation and the fact that I see, because it's spring and people are out fertilizing their grasses, the grass. That's very harmful for the environment. It's harmful for the birds. It's harmful, it goes into the water. I see watering grass is very wasteful. There's different choices that we need to make in regards to following God's creation.
Thank you and amen. Thanks. And what I love too is how you just translate it. And this would be my hope, because I know I'm talking at you a lot right now, which is actually profoundly uncomfortable for me. I'm just going to keep naming my discomfort. Is how you just translated that into a truth that I know of you, the work that you do in gardens and in creation. And you're translating some of this. And I would hope from today, like, we can do translation work about what are the myths or that I have internalized. What are the places of identity that I have latched onto to keep myself feeling safe? What are the ways I might be experiencing the Spirit inviting me to continue to soften? What does it mean for me in this time and us to follow the way of the cross? What does it mean to be a resurrection people? That those questions, and we would each say to each other, hey, from my seat as I garden, here's how I see the Spirit's call. Hey, here's how I see it. So I thank you for naming that to us. Yeah.
Sarah, I'm wondering if you could speak to the emergence of this narrative that recasts Christian nationalism as the persecuted.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And how that serves the political theology of Christian nationalism.
Yeah. I would say I grew up deeply believing that. I also was in high school during Columbine, which was at least in my generation's era, the first massive, significant school shooting that got taken up as this. One of the students was asked, "Do you believe in God?" And they responded, "Yes." And so, I was quite sure I was going to go to school and get killed for Jesus. Okay. Because center in that belief is the sense of that I am persecuted. And I'm sure there's actually a lot of people who could speak more about this than me, so I'm just going to riff a response to you. I think this is one of the long critiques that actually a lot of our siblings of color particularly will name to those of us who are white, is that there's something in the formation of whiteness, and that then is wedded with Christianity, which has been tutored to believe that we're suffering. And it gets instrumentalized inside of Christianity. And I think I personally wonder how much of that is even in the epigenetic history of families that were immigrants and were, and the harm that you've known in your family systems and these sorts of things. And this is for me why I am such a firm believer. And we have to do our own inner work, our healing of our own attachment wounds from our childhood. Because as we ourselves, if I know myself as seen and loved by the God of the universe, and not in a way, not in a way where it's a mighty fortress is my God that just allows me to live in a war experience with you, which many of us have had to develop because we grew up in systems, family systems with trauma and all sorts of other generational stuff. It leads us to that's all untended. And you've lived in this position, though, where then that just becomes the central narrative. And I think that has to become the way then to healing and being able to get disrupted to move into deeper solidarity around racial justice, et cetera. Like that needs to get lovingly, deeply troubled. But that, it's very pervasive, this sense of like, I am being persecuted. I'm not being persecuted for my faith. Like, and also it's not persecution if you work in a job and you have to work with someone who is a woman or is gay. Like, so there's this narrative, and I think you do need to like lovingly speak to that. And I think part of the way I choose to do that is through being like, you're loved. Like, what's the wounds you carry? Okay, let's let Jesus heal them. And then we can work on the same time at other bigger justice issues. I don't know. Is that just conversational with what? Did I hear you? Okay. All right, we'll do one more right now, and then I'll say a couple more things.
One thing I really struggle with is there's so many ways I can do better, And I think, okay, so should I be riding my bicycle from where I live to go pick up my Target order instead of taking the car? And, and it's what kind of food I buy and packaging. And I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And it's like, how do you transition? How do you take that on so that you're not, living in a cabin in the woods, growing your own produce, and it's just like there's such a continuum there.
Yep.
And how do I incorporate that into my being in a workable way that still is challenging, but
Thank you. Thanks for naming that. I'm sure no one else here has ever had this struggle. So the nervous laughter or other laughter I heard was probably, I think this is a really real struggle. And I think throughout probably the history of humanity, particularly I am for sure in the history of the church, this has been a deep wrestling. So you do see long histories of Christians and Christian movements that do things like, for instance, in the early church, the early monastics, they went to the desert intentionally because they saw the ways in which Christianity was becoming wedded with the empire, with money, etc. And they went to the desert to try to purify themselves and their faith. So you'll see movements of that are more aesthetic, like more, and I don't mean that like pretty. I mean that, people will make a choice to say, no, I'm going to live an intentional life of poverty. And then you see all sorts of folks in between. I am probably more so of the belief that if I am actively aware that I am participating on the daily in decisions to prevent my workers from receiving livable wages and these sorts of things, there's gradations. And I know I participate in it all the time. So I think to the wrestle value, I hope that as a communities of faith and as people of faith, we keep wrestling. And we keep challenging and inviting lovingly each other. What does it mean to live in a world in which the creation, all of it is God's? How can I wrestle with how I live that out? Even as I know I'm going to do it imperfectly, but how do I remain in a posture of openness and being critically reflective, even as I also know, there's a part of me that's and I know I'm always participating. Yep. And so what does grace and being human in that look like? So it's a messy answer, but I think hopefully we all keep wrestling with that together. So let me just because I've thrown a lot at you. So fundamentally, Christian nationalism is really about the ways in which the kind of imaginations, the categories, the story, the language of Christianity gets wrapped up in a particular mythological telling of what it means to be American and Christian and white. Christian nationalism weds those things together and is much more about that wedding, that preserving of a particular kind of social order. Okay. I think fundamentally when we're talking about Christian nationalism, that is what we're talking about. So whenever you see, Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president, but whenever it's like, whenever we wed too closely as Christians, if you're ever alone, you're like, is this Christian nationalism? Anytime we are wedding too closely together, our Christian faith and the politics of state and of power, that should always be concerning. And hopefully we get self-reflective. And particularly when we notice, or if we can, that we're being particularly defensive about anyone pushing at some of the stories that we also believe about ourselves, about the founding of our country, about how things work out for people that may not have the same backgrounds and stories as us. So Christian nationalism really is fundamentally when our being American and Christian gets too wedded together in a way that preserves power. And political theology is both a category that can help us to think about and understand, on the one hand, helpfully, how does your faith impact the way you think about politics and how you order your life? But then secondly, it can help us to be critically reflective about when we're getting gamed. Okay? It can help us to be critically reflective about when we are getting gamed by people who are saying, Jesus, 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 while actually like harming us and other people, right? To be critically reflective and aware of the ways in which Christianity gets weaponized. And so then that way we can invite each other and the church itself more broadly to follow the way of Jesus, okay? And so political theology in that way is about the way categories of Christianity get employed and weaponized for power. And hopefully for us, it's being able to be reflective and critical about that. So that hopefully, to go Lutheran again, we can be a people who are not about the theologies of glory to keep or get ourselves in power, but about the way of the cross, right? Where Jesus was actually killed by an empire, right? For bearing witness to another kingdom and another way of being. So I think this is particularly important in general because I guess I've given most of my life to saying that there must be something about Jesus. But also because I recognize that I am a white American who is trying to follow Jesus. And I turn to the work of the new political theology of folks like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Dorothy Zola, Moltmann, and then other liberation theologies, particularly Black and Latin American theologians. Because I think it's very important and vital for me as a white Christian theologian, pastor, human, etc., to take seriously what does it mean to say I follow Jesus in view, if for them it was in view of they were doing theology post-Auschwitz, I am doing theology here in view of the twin genocides and erasures and violences against Native persons in our country and the enslavement and the legacies of racism against Black people. For me to take that seriously at the core of my faith, of what does it mean then to speak the name Jesus in view of that. So that's part of when, in the next session, what I want to turn toward is what does it mean for us to take that seriously? And what are some ways of thinking theologically that can help us in our own faith to wrestle with and continue to deepen into what does it mean to follow the way of the cross? What does that look like? Let me see. I said this, I think, so I'm just making sure. Yeah. Okay. For instance, what I will just say about this, going toward next week. If one of the categories inside of a Christian nationalist imagination, one of the ways of understanding God is God as the divine sovereign. If you've heard any of my messages over the last number of years, you'll hear me speak about things as like, God is the white Zeus in the sky. Okay, that's Christian nationalism, basically, like subtext, that's what's going on. Is I'm naming the ways in which we've taken our understanding of God and we've actually imbued it with this very powerful, old white dude on a throne, sovereign guy who is actually Zeus, not Jesus. Just so you know, right? Because there's power in that imagination, right? If I have this sovereign God who like buffets me against anything that threatens me, it gives me a sense of safety and being in the world. I just don't think that, that's actually helpful for us in being Christian in the world and loving our neighbor as ourselves. And it doesn't help us, I think, in really journeying the way of Jesus. So I'm going to invite us then to turn to some understandings and conceptions of God and of what it means, like what are images that can help us as Christians to also imagine ourselves as the followers of Jesus then. So again, spoiler alert. So one I will talk about next week is God is Yahweh. And how does God as the great I am, the ground of our being, how does that help us to embody a faith that isn't about power and self-protection and preservation, but it can help us to open ourselves in a different way, okay? I will talk about Jesus because that seems important for Christians. Thank you. I've worked on being funny for a long time, so I'm so glad when it works. It's one of the challenges of growing up a fundamentalist. I didn't understand humor. And so I like how I want to like call Andy and be like, I made joke. He tells me that ruins it. So Jesus, we'll talk about Jesus. But then, for instance, one I want to talk about for particular in our community that's been central is we've had a conception arising really out of the Congregationalist history of we are pilgrims. Okay. So, for instance, in my dissertation and in a few sermons that I'm sure all of you remember, you don't, but is I've talked about being a person on pilgrimage. So what does it mean, for instance, for us, and as our church too, to move from saying, I am a pilgrim in the way of the mythologized founding of our nation sort of way, which actually was a myth that didn't really come into being until the 21st century, just so you know, historical accuracy does matter to me. Christian is so happy, I think, right now. But instead of that, the mythology of the pilgrim who triumphed over the native person. Okay. That's a problem if we like buy into that mythology too far. What does it mean, though, that as people who follow Jesus, we are people on pilgrimage? And that there is a sense of being pilgrims in that way. What does it mean? So how can that help us, too? To like the way of the cross doesn't mean you die, that you disappear and God hates you. Okay? It means that the stuff we think will keep us safe, that's the stuff Jesus wants to melt away, I think. And so, like, be on pilgrimage, be a pilgrim. Just don't be a mythologized one that's into like genocide. Cool? You know, I mean, right? Like that shouldn't be controversial, I think. And so those sorts of imaginations that I think can help us, both in terms of who is God and how do we understand ourselves, so that we can keep working it out together, right? Okay, you have been incredibly gracious, and I am grateful for that. And I'm going to send you with a note of blessing. Okay, so I would just like to say this. The very first sermon that I ever preached here when I was on staff was during Reforming. And it was on the passage where Jesus shows up with a woman at the well. And I named this, how Jesus says to her, in spirit and in truth. And I said, the answer is already in this room. So may we be a people who listen in, people who are willing to open ourselves to the whispering of the Spirit, people who let each other, those others, and God trouble us and open us to questions and new ways of seeing. And in all of this, may we trust that the I am who met Moses in the burning bush, the I am who met a Samaritan woman at the well, the I am who has shown up throughout history is the same I am who loves you, who loves me, and who is doing a new thing amongst all who live in spirit and in truth. So may you go in that spirit, and may that truth hold you in love. Amen.